Hello everyone, it's Sientir, and I've got another Rambler for you. And today I'm finally going to get around to talking about sin. It's a topic that I've been bringing up a lot, I feel like, lately, and I think it's finally time to just sit down and talk about it at length. So, when I've generally been talking about it in the past and kind of summarizing, I've described it typically along the lines of doing wrong by someone. And while I think that's kind of accurate, it's a little bit imprecise, if that makes sense. It's a bit general. And so I want to kind of dig down into more detail. This is going to kind of come in a couple of parts. And the focus is largely going to be on how to define when something is a sin rather than defining what is a sin, if that makes sense. So there's a couple of concepts that I think I need to address right away. Also, I should, while I'm thinking about it, add in that this is going to build off of, in many regards, the Musings on Morality Rambler. So I'll try to remember to link that in the description. That has a lot of concepts that are going to come back in this one and apply here, in large part because sin is dealing with violating some moral guidance, or basically violating morality. It gets kind of complicated and nuanced. But anyway, the first thing that I want to kind of talk about that I think is really important is kind of understand a concept that I've seen referred to as dualism. This is not some sort of Eastern idea of like the good and the bad and the good, the yin-yang sort of thing, but rather more of a Greek or Hellenistic idea that the flesh, the physical, is evil and the spiritual or mental is good. This is a concept that I think has heavily influenced a lot of our moral thinking today and is the leading cause of things like really tasty or luxurious foods, for example, being seen as sinful. That's kind of a way of saying that they're kind of enjoying them as evil. Kind of expand upon this Hellenistic dualism. It's kind of the idea, like I said, that the physical is evil, therefore physical pleasures are bad or evil. If you're physically enjoying something, then that's an evil thing. Whereas if it's more of a spiritual, mental thing, then that's good. So I think that this might be part of why we would view things as like reading is really a good thing, for example, and saying that you love reading is considered a good thing. Whereas like other things, for example, like sex, for example, tends to be viewed negatively because of these ideas. Sort of the extreme example of how this kind of played out actually in the New Testament church, or the early Christian church, was that there were people who denied that Jesus came in the flesh, that Jesus was a physical, a human. And this was because you couldn't have the holy God mixed with the profane flesh. You couldn't do this mixing of the holy and the profane, and because they saw the physical as profane, then that couldn't have been. And so you'll find passages in the New Testament that address this directly and say, no, God came in the flesh. He was physical, he was human, he was among us. That was a really big deal. Now, whether or not you believe that happened or not, I guess is up to you. But this was kind of a point of contention among some people because of this idea of dualism. So this concept is something that is false, at least from my point of view and my moral understanding, is this Hellenistic idea of dualism is completely false. But I do think it has had a lot of, I'm not sure subconscious is quite the right word when you're talking about like social conditioning, social thought, broader cultural morality ideas, like broader cultural ideas about morality. But it definitely has, I think there's been an undercurrent of it that's influenced much of the thinking in regards to this sort of stuff. So that's kind of something that has a big impact on a lot of moral reasoning. And again, I think it confuses things because then people will see things, particularly this comes up with like chocolate, for example, where it's sinfully delicious. There is no such thing as sinfully delicious. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. And I would definitely argue that sinfully delicious is a nonsense phrase. But that definitely, there has been that sort of thought that, something that's super delicious must therefore be sinful because it's pleasuring the body, and that's a physical thing. If there's time, I will want to, in this one, talk about how the New Testament uses the term flesh to refer to something that gets called the sin nature. But that's something that I kind of want to address a little bit later. So I want to talk then about sin itself. So this is going back to kind of the idea of moral perspective, or that morality is kind of based upon point of view, and then the relevance of your morality is based upon how much authority you wield. So when we look at this, when something is deemed sinful, that's another way of saying it's morally evil. Now, there's lots of ways that you can kind of approach this moral understanding, and so different people will have different ideas of what this looks like. Generally, there are some overlaps. For example, most people agree that murder is evil, is sinful. Most people agree that certain types of lying, at least, is sinful. Not everybody will agree that all types of lying is sinful, though. That's where the concept of white lies come from. So there's some variance there. Now, if I'm going back into sort of Christian thinking, then again, we'd have something like the ultimate authority, the ultimate judge, or rather the judge that matters most would be God, and therefore his moral perspective is the one that matters. Now, there's something that's interesting that gets talked about, particularly in the New Testament, that kind of says you have to, like, if you have some additional restriction in terms of how you're thinking, that can play a part into it. So the example that came up a lot in that time was meat sacrificed to idols. Now, meat sacrificed to idols doesn't mean anything because the idols weren't a thing for it to be meaningfully towards. But if somebody thought that it was meaningful, by eating that meat, then they could violate what was morally correct because they are engaging in it from a certain point of view. There's a lot that matters about intent when it comes to sin from a biblical perspective. There's the action, but there's also the intent. Sometimes the action can be very mundane, but the way that the person's coming at it or their understanding of it can transform the nature of the action into something that is sinful, again, from the perspective of God, according to sort of Christian thinking. Now, we can see these concepts of like sinfulness play out around us, and there's a lot of debate around what things are sinful, what things are more sinful than other things, what things should be receiving punishment, and it tends to be a very complicated part of social framework and sort of how society structures itself. Anyway, I think now then would be a good time to kind of move into that topic of when the Bible talks about the sin nature. It often uses the word flesh. I think this is potentially borrowing from those Hellenistic ideas because the word would have had some of that connotation, but it's not referring to the physical body so much as it's referring to kind of the internal workings of the human condition. So in the book of James, the author goes through and basically kind of dissects sin. And he says right here, James 1:14-15, "But each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." So there's a couple of important things to see here. The first thing is that we tend to use the word tempted poorly. We tend to use it in a way that is confused, if that makes sense. Tempted traditionally has meant considering doing something evil or being enticed to do something wrong. But we often now kind of just use it in a generic, that appeals to me sense, like I'm considering doing this thing, but I'm not sure if I want to. That's not necessarily temptation. You can't be tempted to do good, although we might say something that way. At least, but the underlying concept of what tempted is referring to, it, particularly in this passage, is not about like you can't be tempted to do good in the way that this passage is referring to tempted. Tempted in this case is entirely about being enticed to do something that you know you shouldn't. And the way that it kind of goes through this is it talks about being dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. So this is about evil desires. So the evil desire doesn't cause or isn't sin in and of itself, but it causes sin. This is where when somebody gives into that evil desire, that's when they engage in sin. And then again, when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. The idea that sin separates us from God Because God is a sinless being, God can't abide sin. God must separate himself from sin. Sin can't be near him. In the same way that darkness cannot reside near light. It just doesn't work. You need something to project a shadow for there to be darkness. So you can't actually bring the darkness next to the light. The best you can do is have something try to create shadow near it. It's in the same way sin can't be near God, or in a similar way anyway. And what then happens, again, this is Christian point of view, God is the source of life. If you're separated from the source of life, then you kind of don't have life anymore. The thing that's important here, though, is what are evil desires? Now, the thing that's notable is that it's not saying all desire is evil. It's saying that there are evil desires. And this is what then gets referred to as the sin nature. This is something that I want to explore more in a future sort of series, specifically about the 7 deadly sins. I think there's a lot to sort of understand when we dissect those. But in general, I would say most evil desires are wanting to fulfill a legitimate desire in a poor way. For example, somebody could have a desire for intimacy, but try to take shortcuts to get it. And that's not pursuing the thing properly. It'll ultimately be unfulfilling, and it often is sinful. So the thing, though, that's kind of, I think that kind of covers that a little bit, but there's a prerequisite here that I think is really important to talk about. Christianity has the idea of what people will often refer to as original sin. Original is, I think, just another way of saying like first, but it's also something that we would say, doomed humanity to have a sin nature. And this is something that we call the fall in Christianity. So as Genesis tells, there was Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the thing is, God had said, don't eat from this tree, but she ended up choosing to eat from it anyway because she's deceived by the serpent and decided that she trusted the serpent just as much as she trusted God, basically, I guess. And that was what, in many regards, the sin was. The eating of it was the act of disobeying God's directive, which means you're no longer treating God as God, and that's kind of a core idea of what sin is, or at least that's a major sin in God's perspective, is to not treat him as God. So that event then set off the fall, where humanity was banished from the Garden of Eden and was given a limited lifespan. Limited lifespan makes sense, because otherwise people who'd wanted to do bad things would continue to live and do bad things, basically, is sort of the idea. But it also leaves humanity kind of trapped in a broken state, basically. So death came, and so this original sin, or first sin, kind of set humanity into a position of needing to live out sin nature, and it put people under a curse. I kind of want to talk about some of that curse at a future point, but I don't think it's appropriate for this particular Rambler. So this kind of covers the idea of sin, and again, I think it's good to summarize. In general, sin is violating some moral imperative, some moral code, and then somebody kind of judges something to be sinful, something to be wicked, based upon their moral code, and then there's a lot of different thoughts about what a moral code should look like, what things should be part of a moral code. And that really complicates the idea of what sin is, and I think things have gotten very confused in the matter. So I think that wraps things up. I need to do my little outro, so hopefully I can get a little bit more concise this time. If you would, you can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/SientirsRamblers. You can also contact me directly by email, sientir@gmail.com. That's SIENTIR for Sientir. And if you have the financial bandwidth, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider supporting me at patreon.com/Sientir. Thank you, everyone. Take care, and bye-bye.